Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer Fantasy lore. I've been wanting to start a series on magic in the Warhammer world, because it is honestly one of the most interesting and unique parts of Warhammer Fantasy that very rarely actually gets the attention it deserves. But instead of going through the dry things of what schools of magic do what, etc., and listing their spells, I figured instead we'd talk about how to become a necromancer. It seemed like an apt delivery device for the lore for necromancers in Warhammer Fantasy, as the necromancers are a rather fascinating little bunch. First and foremost because they are somehow uniquely human. And by that I mean only humans become necromancers. Only humans embrace the art of necromancy. Now, there are some other factions that utilize Dar, the dark wind of magic, and obviously the opposite of high magic. But even they, the Dark Elves, by and large, don't actually use it for necromancy. And I suppose you could argue that the vampires, who also use necromancy, aren't specifically necessarily human, but at the same time, they were once. So clearly, there is something about necromantic magic that immediately turns off everybody else. Now, why could that be? Obviously, a part of it is how unfathomably dangerous dark magic is. And we'll get a little bit deeper into the specific nature of Dar later on, but for now, all you need to know is that it's kind of like juggling with water balloons filled with anthrax. It is potentially an extraordinarily effective weapon, but you better have very steady hands. And so, most of the other older races, like the elves or the dwarves or the lizardmen, might be forgiven for simply looking at Dar and going, no. Meanwhile, we humble humans with our limited lifespan and also relatively limited historical span as major organized nations might look at that very self-same power and think, well, I'm only going to live for about 80 years anyways. What have I really got to lose? And if I pull it off, I will gain immortality. And that is, of course, another major reason why humans tend to seek out necromancy beyond everybody else. They have got the amusingly almost unique combination of an ability and drive to learn things that are highly complex, like magic, along with a lifespan long enough for them to begin to master some of the deeper secrets of magic, whilst also being short-lived enough to the point where they are willing to take extreme risks in order to pursue their goals. This is things that would, for example, preclude the Skaven picking up necromancy. Although, they would benefit enormously from it. Can you imagine a Skaven necromancer? You'd think they were numerous before. Oh, boy. But the Skaven's problem, of course, despite having potentially have a lot to gain from embracing necromancy, is that they are not long-lived enough to really truly delve into its secrets. And secondly, they are way too cowardly to fuck with something as dangerous as Dar. Even the most deranged of Grey Seers would only tap into that power as an absolute last resort, and that again should put the lethality of Dar into sharp focus, as the Skaven are known for eating warpstone, which is somehow a healthier and safer pursuit. Granted, mostly due to their unique biology, but nevertheless. And most other races either again have specific rulings or standards against it, or are simply morally repelled by the very idea. Obviously, something like the lizardman would know this is bad and shouldn't be screwed with, whereas races like the dwarves would view the idea of raising the dead to be absolutely and utterly abhorrent, as the worst taboo one could possibly imagine, as they are, of course, an ancestral worshipping race. And that's also why they really, really hate necromancers. So, humans, then, are likely to be the only ones capable of using necromancy to any real degree. There could theoretically be exceptions, but if there even are any, they are vanishingly rare. So, how would one begin down this rather dark path? Well, there are actually legal ways to get started with necromancy, or, well, sort of necromancy anyways, as the Colleges of Magic in Altdorf does offer a course on what isn't straight up necromantic magic, but is fairly close. The Amethyst Order, also known as the Masters of the Lore of Death. Now, make no mistake, an amethyst wizard would take great offense at being called a necromancer, and would go to great lengths to explain to you the countless precise differences between the lore of death and necromancy. And there are a lot of differences, first and foremost in how it interacts with death and how it is fueled. Unlike necromancy, there are countless groups and races that utilize the lore of death. Everything from chaos to ogres to orcs to the high elves themselves. The reason for this far greater usage is because it does not use Dar. Again, Dar is not a wind of magic. It is more of a primeval element of magic. It is dark magic, stagnant, dead magic. The exact opposite, once more, of high magic. And it is, once more, I must stress, not one of the winds of magic. Those 8, fire, heavens, metal, beasts, light, life, shadow, and death, are vital forces. They flow, they blow, thus the name winds of magic. They are ever-changing. Meanwhile, Dar is the exact opposite of that. It is the stagnation and the halting of the winds of magic. It can consist of multiple of the winds, more often than not so, death and shadow, for example, but it is not naturally a part of them. Rather, it is an amalgamation of multiple winds that are grown still in a place. Normally, Dar is found sort of coalescing naturally, like smoke or some other poisonous substance that seek out the ground. Those who are magically inclined can actually see Dar in the world as a darkish, foreboding mist, often found in places of great tragedy or death, or extremities of negative emotions. Think battlefields, mass burial sites, or villages ravaged by disease. These would be natural places to find Dar, and places that necromancers will eagerly seek out to draw power from. Meanwhile, a wizard of the lore of death would not be drawing any power from these places. In fact, they would often venture to them specifically to disperse the Dar. One of the leading tasks of the priests of Mor, and also wizards of the lore of death, is indeed to get rid of that Dar, as both of them view it as an affront to their own schools of magic and their beliefs. As Moore, of course, guardian of the underworld and guide of the dead, viewed dark magic, the quite opposite, and obviously the raising of the dead, as something exceptionally heretical. Unfortunately, both for the priests of Moore and the lore of death, there are a lot of tragedies in the Warhammer world, and so you can very rarely, if ever, have any hope of actually getting rid of Dar permanently from any sizable area, even in major civilized built-up nations like the Empire. It is a losing campaign against ever-mounting horrors. And in many other nations like Bretonia, for example, where large parts of the land outside the castles of local lords is practically unguarded and left to its own devices, there's going to be quite a lot of such stagnant places. So, to continue our hypothetical, a necromancer might first join the colleges of magic officially to learn the very basics of the lore of death. But at some point he would then be tempted away from the more holy path towards something darker altogether. Why would this be? Well, the most obvious motivation, of course, is fear of death. The realization that a mere human is a mortal entity, an entity that will have scarce 8 decades or so to learn and master mysteries that other creatures have studied for millennia. It can very easily make one's life feel, well, somewhat pointless, honestly. Why am I even wasting my time studying the laws of magic when the very book I am reading has been written by a person who's 2,000 years old? What fucking hope have I? Unless... And often, the motivation to head down this path can come from good ideas. Perhaps death can finally be conquered on a more natural basis. I mean, if the spirits are real, if they continue to exist, mayhaps there is some way to bridge the gap, and not just bring back the undead as the undead, but actually eternal life. That's a common one. Alternatively, it's the idea of, well, if I just go a little bit deeper in this direction, it'll probably give me some real powerful revelations about the cleaner forms of magic. Or expediencies. Okay, I don't want to read this dusty old tome written by a high elf wizard in a language I can barely understand. I would much rather simply bind a spirit within a skull and have it whisper its secrets to me. But no matter how well-meaning and optimistic the original intent may be, it is nearly universal for a necromancer to fall prey to madness. There are exceptions, one or two, albeit extraordinarily rare, in which necromancers have actually chosen to act in, if not necessarily so a good manner, then at the very least in a human manner, shall we say. There are, for example, necromancers in Bretonia that seemingly don't seek to conquer the land or anything, but simply operates as some sort of supernatural feudal lord, and who are often just plain ignored by the rest of Bretonia, because dealing with them seems like a hell of a lot more bother than simply letting them be. There was even a tale of a necromancer once that used his powers to save his family, not in a raising them from the dead sort of save, but actually rescuing them from witch hunters who had decided to try and burn them due to their familial connections. But for every example of a, at least somewhat sort of decent necromancer, there is a Henrik Kemmler, whose only motivation to do necromancy appears to be to destroy absolutely everything. or Friedrich van Hal, the creators of the Danse Macabre, who also engaged in necromancy simply for his own benefits, and ended up causing a lot of trouble for the rest of the world with his magical advances. Or somebody like Lucius Cypher, who was so thoroughly devoured by his lust for yet more power that he eventually tried to invade Ulthuan with an army of the dead. No doubt to be sunk long before he even saw its shores, but still, the point stands. The majority of necromancers go patently insane rather quickly, probably due to the corrupting influence of Dar, though there are potentially ways to avoid this. So, if one can no longer seek the guidance of the colleges of magic, what would be the next steps for an up-and-coming necromancer? Well, one might be to simply seek out places of necromantic power. Now that one has gained a certain understanding of how to view the magical world, it's entirely conceivable that one could discover Dar and begin to wield it, which would be pretty much akin to placing a toddler next to a nuclear reactor's control panel, but hey, sometimes they pull it off, other times they disappear in a puff of black smoke. Occasionally also followed by a few thousand undead that will ravage the local community, so, not ideal. Not ideal for either party, as this path will absolutely, most assuredly, definitely so, lead to corruption, where the wizard in question will simply just go crazy from being overwhelmed by the dark magic, until he's not so much wielding it as it is wielding him. A slightly safer way to continue one's studies would be to seek out ancient tomes of very forbidden magic. Again, study of the lore of death is not illegal within the Empire, and there was even a time during which outright necromancy and the study of it wasn't illegal either. These days, it's technically sort of kind of okay to study it as it relates to the lore of death, but no, not to engage in it, of course. So, the books that would go like, oh yeah, this is how you prepare a corpse for resurrection, if they even exist within the Imperium, they are going to be locked extremely deep into heavily guarded vaults that you will only get access to if you're probably the Grand Master of the college. So, if you're wanting to get a hold of some books, you're going to have to approach either the black market, and there is a thriving black market within the Imperium, even for magical items, although they tend to be expensive, as I'm sure you can imagine, or you'll have to try and quest for them yourself. This is dangerous. Not just because of the countless natural hazards that inhabit the Warhammer world, bandits, beastmen, and the like, not to mention natural hazards that are quite frequent in a pre-industrial society, but if you're seeking out necromantic lore, you're probably going to be on the radar of quite a few hostile organizations, like the Witch Hunters, for example. And honestly, the Witch Hunters are a rather esoterical threat, compared to the simple fact that, if you manage to let it slip why you're in the village, for example, to raise their relatives or seek out the methods with which to raise their relatives, you're not going to need to wait for the witch hunters to show up, as the local peasant populace will happily beat you to death with sticks right then and there. Hell, they don't even need to know what you're looking for. If you enter town and you look a little bit sketchy, in long purple robes, for example, and you can't identify yourself as an official wizard, well, your reception is likely to be quite woody indeed. And this is to say nothing about the difficulties of actually finding forbidden texts of magic. Yeah, it's a better option than the first one, but still not very easy. The third option is by far the safest and easiest, but it comes with a, significant drawback, and that is to seek out another necromancer and become their apprentice. Obviously, most necromancers have learned to fear strangers for obvious reasons, and are therefore not going to be very interested in taking on apprentices, especially as, more often than not, for a necromancer, being discovered means a very, very imminent visit from the witch hunters, or a large group of angry peasants wielding pitchforks and torches, so they're unlikely to be overly welcoming. If you can find a necromancer, convincing him to actually teach you something, considering that, the primary motivating factors behind necromancers' efforts to learn necromancy is usually things like a selfish desire to live forever, it's not going to be easy. In fact, I'd say damn near impossible. There is, however, a group of individuals who constantly desire more necromancers and who will eagerly offer to train future generations of necromancers. And, best of all, they're next door. The vampire counts of Sylvania. Sylvania employs quite a few necromancers to maintain their armies, and to make sure that they are capable of levying them in large numbers if the counts ever need to go to war with the surrounding empire. Indeed, one of the main reasons why the empire hasn't simply destroyed Sylvania is because, occupying it would really suck, and invading it in the first place would be very difficult. The Empire largely tells itself that the vampire counts, they've been dealt with. They're not really around anymore, and if they are, they're few and powerless. And besides, there's no such thing as Sylvania anymore. It's just a slightly spicy province at this point. Better to let sleeping vampires lie and all that. But, the vampire counts rarely do anything for free. So if one is to enter their service, you'd have access to a significant library of dark arts, including necromancy, and other necromancers to learn from, to discuss with, and to have a bit of a degree of fellowship, I suppose. However, the cost. The cost is usually eternal servitude, as the vampires highly value their specialized necromantic servants, and tend to extract offers of, again, eternal servitude, or at the very least as close as they can get, either through promises, or more likely, magical means, and threats, obviously. Even if you are a powerful necromancer, making an enemy out of a vampire count is ill-advised. But, assuming you are willing to make a deal with the blood-sucking devils themselves, it is the easiest way to learn the arts of necromantic magic. And once one begins to learn them, the power one can gain are significant. It does, of course, as with all things, depend upon one's personal touch and abilities with these things. But necromantic magic can be used to attack enemies directly, to curse them with disabilities, to destroy them outright even. Necromantic magics can also be used to age an individual abnormally, causing them to literally die of old age in minutes or seconds. It can also be used for defensive purposes by hardening the necromancer's skin. And indeed, necromancers who've been practicing their arts for an extended period of time become almost death-like themselves, drawn, sallowed, pale skins, and blood that flows sluggishly in their veins, even before they eventually conquer death entirely, as some have. And most notably, of course, is the command over death that necromancy grants to its wielders. Not just in terms of raising, but also controlling the dead. This is one of the reasons why the lore of death still does, in some extremely specific cases, study the arts of necromancy. Because there are ways within it to halt the undead, to bind them, to unravel them, sending their spirits back into Mor's realm. They can also block them from going places that they're not supposed to go. One of the reasons, for example, that most of the Empire's graveyards are constructed to be veritable mazes, often resplendent with various icons of Mor, is to make it more difficult for any entrepreneuring skeleton to find its way out and into the local population centers. And many sigils of Mor as well can be used to literally forbid the dead from going into certain places. These abilities to restrict the movements of the undead, to bind them or to destroy them, would of course be incredibly valuable to priests of Mor or the masters of the lore of death if they're ever called upon to enter an area that is occupied by the undead, which normally means the presence of a necromancer, but not always. The Warhammer world is one filled with magic, and it is not always necessary for a necromancer to be around for the dead to start wandering. And there are even cases of areas being so infested with Dar that they become gathering spots for unnatural creatures, things like ghosts, wights, or indeed the walking dead. Usually of the lower ranks, things like zombies, but still. And it is simply just a part of the duties of the priests of Mor to go in and clean out the unnaturals. For our necromancer in question, however, well, control over the dead is certainly useful, especially if you're going to go into an area like that, so thoroughly suffused with Dar that you might be accosted by ghosts and other creatures on the way. But the primary purpose is, of course, to bend the dead to the necromancer's will. And this takes a few different forms. One of the most common is a zombie. The zombie is a relatively recently dead person that can be reanimated with relatively little effort, seeing as there is still, to a degree, muscle and sinew, etc., to move the bones. But somebody who's been dead for a long time and a more valued addition to a necromantic army, like a skeleton, requires significantly more power, as the skeleton itself is, well, it's moved by magic. The bones themselves must be infused with magic, because there is nothing there to move them. Hell, there's nothing there to bind them together. This requires a lot more power, but it is not by any stretch of the imagination an unimaginable amount, and a necromancer does not need to continuously replenish the power. Once a skeleton has been raised, it's up and about for as long as the necromancer is around, for as long as the magic is around. In the case of someone like Kemler, for example, he was raising entire graveyards before he was even 50 years old. Now, the Lich Master is certainly an exception to the rule rather than the norm, but still, it goes to show how powerful a necromancer can be, and how relatively soon he can become powerful, as bear you in mind, like, 30, 40, 50 years of study is nothing for a wizard. And in terms of power to time invested, there is nothing that even comes close to beating necromancy. As of course a traditional wizard is going to need to kill somebody with a spell. Something that requires the winds of magic to cooperate, which isn't always going to happen, or is going to require some advanced enchantment or ritual. Whereas if a necromancer wants to kill someone, well, he's got 24 ways to do it magically, or he could simply just have one of his walking corpse buddies go up and stab you. Sure, the average skeleton isn't in and of itself particularly dangerous, but that too is very much so a relative thing, as a skeleton, something that must be bludgeoned into destruction, or otherwise it'll simply stab you, running at you full tilt, leaping, jumping, stabbing, flailing, everything. A regular human is going to have a hard time not dying to that. A wizard is going to have an easier time just blowing it apart with a fireball or something, but still, you don't have that much of a window of time before this gets very, very dangerous. And skeletons, of course, are not the most dangerous creations that a necromancer can bring. Necromancers can also, of course, gain control over other forms of the dead, like spirits or ghosts. These are usually not as harmful in the traditional sense, but can often suck the very life force out of the living. They're also far more difficult to deal with because, well, they're not physical objects. They usually need to be destroyed by some form of magic or enchanted weaponry, or occasionally through extreme effort, but it's going to be rather difficult. And even that is not the most powerful servant that an up-and-coming necromancer might recruit. They can also get access to things like wights. Now, much like the skeletons, these are not just regular dead people. You can potentially create a skeleton warrior out of a fresh carcass by simply boiling the bones, for example, but the warrior in question tends to be far more effective if it has been dead for quite some time. The spirit bond appears stronger. Furthermore, a warrior will make a better skeletal warrior than a peasant will. Again, which is why zombies become an entirely different form of cannon fodder. And when it comes to things like wights, they are usually recruited from dead noblemen, from long gone past times, when humanity lived in barbarism before the Empire. Things like burial mounds and cairns that contain the remnants of such leaders are very interesting objectives for necromancers. To the point, of course, that they are usually watched over by the forces that oppose them, like priests of Mor, or they are simply destroyed or removed, meaning that you're not going to find too many of them. More often than not, you might come across them in the deep north, for example, or in areas where humans don't really like to go. The areas near Athelloren come to mind, or alternatively in the deeper south, as well, I mentioned that only humans become necromancers, and that is true, but there's also technically undead necromancers like the Tomb Kings. Now, Tomb Kings, again, are very different from your regular run-of-the-mill undead, but there are ample access to various barbarian tombs not associated with the Tomb Kings in the southern reaches of the old world, which can provide a necromancer with a powerful servant that can even occasionally be imbued with a portion of the necromancer's power to act as a sort of sub-commander, as we see, of course, in the case of Kemmler and his favorite warrior, Krell, the undead chaos warrior. Naturally, very few necromancers are ever going to get quite that lucky with a servant like Krell, but it's still something worth considering. So, Our up-and-coming necromancer have now learned how to actually raise the dead. What's next? Well, you'd think that that would be enough, and in some cases, it actually is. Take the example of Pitre Fonce, also known as the Madman of Mucilon. He is a necromancer of significant power, ridiculously significant power, to the point where he has himself a white king. But what's he doing? Is he trying to conquer the world? Is he trying to destroy the Bretonnian countryside? No, he's pretty much just chilling. He's set himself up as a local feudal lord and is sat in his tower studying his scrolls and reading whatever books of forbidden nonsense he's gathered over the years. He will actively protect himself against anyone who tries to screw with him, and he has quite stridently chastised a fair few local Bretonnian lords that have erroneously believed that his territory is part of theirs. But beyond that, he's surprisingly relaxed for a master of the dead. For many other necromancers, obtaining immortality, eternal life, is the goal, and once they do, they might retreat to the countryside to become hedge wizards or to continue their studies. They too will usually not be all that much of a bother, although the local witch hunters will usually take issue with them regardless. But many become irreversibly corrupted by the powers that they utilize. Dar. Again, Dar is naturally destructive. It is a force of chaos. It is corrupting in and of itself, and so wielding it for any long extent of time tends to be very bad for the soul and the mind. In most cases, this will push the necromancer further towards gaining more power, for nefarious reasons that usually has to do with the death of anything and everything. As the oldest necromancers we know of, usually either vampires or direct servants of Nagash, well, their only real objective is to wipe out everything. That too, rather famously, was Nagash's main purpose for his long-standing war with the Skaven of a crippled peak. He wanted to rule a world of dust and darkness and bones. Not because I imagine he'd enjoy it. I mean, he's an undead lich. I don't think he takes much pleasure in anything anymore. But because he was driven to do so. In part due to the revenge, of course, but in larger parts because of the drives of the dark powers, I believe. As this is also something we commonly see in the more ancient practitioners of necromancy, like Vasoran, the father of vampires. They simply want to wipe out the world. Not because that makes a whole lot of sense, because the world is where all the good stuff happens, all the fun and entertaining things, but simply because that is what Dar wishes. Dar is, in certain ways, a magical equivalent of antimatter. It is a destructive force that naturally, as an aspect of its very being, craves annihilation, craves destruction, craves the still of the grave. And anyone fully suffused by it will naturally begin to pursue these objectives themselves. That is the greatest challenge at the end of the day for any necromancer. If you achieve immortality, will you do so with enough of your mind intact to actually enjoy it? Or will you, in seeking out this forbidden time, waste all of it by becoming nothing more than a mindless servant of a power you cannot even truly comprehend, much less so actually control? It's not a great end of the story for our poor aspiring necromancer, but, I mean, come on. becoming a necromancer was never going to be a healthy, long-term ambition for anyone. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.